And welcome back, everyone. Before I go to the European Team Chess Championship tomorrow, I wanted to bless you with a gem which I found on YouTube on the C-Squared podcast by Fabiano Caruana and Christian Kurilla. And they went into a deep dive in one of the final games of the FIDE Grand Swiss between Anish Giri and Niemann Hans from the last round, which then also decided that Giri actually won the tournament after all because of his nice victory in the last round. And the whole game went pretty unnoticed by me. I mean, it seemed like a very nice positional game by Anish, but there were so many interesting things which Fabi has also shared in his masterclass. That's kind of a new format which they have now on their channel. Definitely check it out. I've linked it in the video description down below. This was number 2 of Fabi's masterclass. I really enjoyed it. I watched all of it, the whole video. I watched it 2 times just to get familiar with all of the details. And in this video, I wanted to share some of their analysis and some of my inputs into that as well. So let's head on to the analysis board. So in the last round, it was quite clear that both Anish and Hans had to win the game to be able to qualify or to have chances to qualify even. And what was interesting that Fabi sort of criticized Hans's opening choice by playing the one of the main lines in the English, which I thought was a little bit harsh because I feel like Hans maybe expected Anish also to take a little bit more risk and therefore was trying to be solid and then just get his own chances. But I do sort of agree that he went into maybe not the perfect position against Anish, where Anish managed to keep some pressure in the long run and no risk whatsoever, which is especially what Anish excels at, very, very technical chess. So Anish went for e3, bishop e4, one of the very big lines in the English. Now queen c2, bishop takes e3 was played, which is the modern main move. I should add that the more logical move, short castle, runs into knight d5, and therefore most black players now prefer to take on c3 immediately. It does give away the bishop pair, but on the other hand, white's queen on c3 is going to be a little bit misplaced. That's also what Fabi mentioned in this video, and black does get the immediate idea to play for d5. Now here white has a couple of different moves. I'm not gonna go into too much depth. Fabi also mentioned that he played b3 on 2 occasions, which is also possible. a3 was played in their game. I think I also had one game from the white side with the move d4. I've also played a3 myself with white. I still feel like a3 is probably overall the best try here from the white side. The idea is just that white can prepare to go b4 in some instances. Now Hans went for the most precise move, d5. What I did not know, which Fabi also pointed out, was that short castle might be a little bit imprecise because now white starts with b4 and after d5 now, white can take, and now the very nice move queen c4. And Caruana actually had a game here with the black pieces against Nepo, where he played the logical move bishop e6, but now white goes queen c2, and the whole idea is if white goes queen c2 immediately, then black is in time to play e4 and black is doing pretty well. But here after queen c4, bishop e6, queen c2, now black does not have the move e4 because white could just capture, and therefore white is just pleasantly better with a very nice Sicilian due to the 2 bishops. So that's why d5 is more precise, and it was also played by Hans. Now c takes d5 would be less good because after knight takes d5, queen c4, black could go knight b6 or also bishop e6 here when black hasn't castled short yet, and black keeps some options to castle queenside later on as well. For example, this would also be an option and black immediately gets the move e4 here. So d4 was played. Now we have a lot of exchanges in the center and now the move c5, which is still, I think, by number of games the main move, but Fabi justifiably pointed out that short castle is probably objectively a little bit better or might be a little bit easier. The idea is to then go rook d8 and then to recapture on d5 with the rook gaining some time. However, white does get the extra option to play c5 here, which was not mentioned by Fabi in their analysis, which is also completely okay for black, but he does need to be a little bit precise, I would say. One encounter between 2 grandmasters went as follows: knight e4, bishop d3, bishop f5, short castle, and black typically gets enough counterplay with a5, followed either by b6 in some cases, or just playing for the light squares like this, and the game later on ended in a draw. But c5 was played by Hans, queen h4. And now black has a couple of different moves. Hans went bishop e6. Also interesting is g5, also pointed out by Fabi. You can analyze this with the computer. It goes on quite a long, there's a pretty long variation in the end. I still feel like white does keep some pressure, but white also needs to know many things, and it gets super sharp. I will just briefly skip through the moves here. This was my main variation. And both sides castle queenside. Now bishop a4 was important, and in the very end we get the following endgame most likely. Here white doesn't need to trade the queens, but he can, and I felt like white has practical chances in this endgame. I wasn't fully sure if it's so easy for black, but of course all of this was also not entirely forcing. Both sides had some options in between. Bishop e6 was played by Hans. D takes e4 might be a little bit more precise, with the idea that now black could go for bishop e6 and there is not going to be bishop b5 check as it happened in the game. But now in the game, this was played, and now we should stop for a moment and evaluate the position, because this is exactly what white is kind of hoping for in this variation. But the question is why. The position looks pretty dry, but what white has is the two bishop advantage, and especially the dark squared bishop, since black does not have a dark squared bishop, could prove very useful in the near future. And white has a very simple plan to just advance the pawns in the center, gain some space, f3, e4, then bishop e3, probably king f2 at some moment, and later on opening up the queenside with b4 is definitely an option as well. Now Hans played rook c8. The next following moves were nothing that spectacular from both sides. They just tried to develop their forces. However, I would like to mention, at least at some moment, it would have been more precise for black to play knight c6 a little bit earlier. For example, here, Anish played h4, and now knight c6 would have been a nice chance, so that after e4 now black is in time to play knight d4 here. Because in the game, Hans started with b6, and only now after e4 he went knight c6. And now black is not able to get knight d4 in time, because white already has played the move bishop e3 here. And therefore white is a tad bit better here in this position. And now I've just shown this position to a couple of my students, and surprisingly none of them really mentioned the in my opinion, most logical move, which was also not played by Hans. But the move rook hd8 feels quite natural to me, because I think that it's very much in black's interest to exchange all of the rooks. Maybe I'm just saying this because Fabi also said it, but to me it feels natural, because typically the rooks are especially powerful in connection with the two bishops, and since white has two bishops here, it's even more powerful than only with one bishop together. That's sort of my logic why keeping one pair of rooks at least is going to be beneficial for white in the two bishop advantage. So after rook fd8, what black can do, for example, if white goes bishop a6, take on d1, rook d8, and still white is a tad bit better here, but without the rooks, I think that black is going to have an easier defensive task ahead of him. But Hans played knight a5, which was also the move which was suggested by, I would say, the majority of my students here. The idea being that the knight often goes to b3, where it looks to be quite annoying for white, but it's not doing so much here as well. I mean, knight c4 could be another idea, or bishop c4, trying to exchange one of those bishops. Generally, if we can exchange either of those bishops, the position just should be a dead draw. There, nothing would be happening there. That's also why Anish played rook d6, so that now knight c4 does not work in view of, I guess, no, not rook takes c6, then there would be still knight takes e3 maybe. But instead we can just take on c4 anyway and go rook d7. The same applies after bishop c4, then also rook d7 would be coming. So Anish is just preparing to line up on the d file. That's my explanation here. Still, rook hd8 would be necessary here when black is actually not doing so bad, for example like this, followed by rook d8. But now Hans played rook h8, g4. The next few moves, Anish was just trying to, with g4, he was trying to gain space on the king side. And now still rook e8 was sort of necessary, trying to exchange some rooks on the d file. But instead Hans went for knight b7, kicking out the rook from d6. Rook d2, knight a5, going for the repetition once. And now Anish improves by putting the rook to d1, so that after knight a5 he can play rook c1 without allowing knight b3, which would be a double attack if the rook would be on d2. Now Hans played the move king e7 when he's really starting to run into quite a lot of trouble. Instead, knight b3 would have been stronger, and after knight rook c3, c4, as pointed out by Fabiano as well, when after f4, king f8 is a nice move. Fabio also mentioned that now it's important that the rook is already on e8, since if the rook would be on h8, then the rooks wouldn't be connected. But here, if f5, the bishop can drop back to f7, and black is not doing so badly. Still, white could keep a lot of pressure by not playing f4, f5 immediately, but just slowly trying to improve the position. Maybe also g5 at some moment could be a better continuation. But king e7 was played, bishop a6, all of those moves now were pretty logical, and now white managed to get the move b4. Knight b3 was played, rook c3, and now we reach sort of the most interesting part of the game, and Hans played the move rook d6. I should mention that c4 here, bishop takes c4 would not be as good because of rook c8, when in this endgame black has serious drawing chances. But instead, after c4, white can slowly try to improve the position. g5 was my logical human move when I was analyzing the position, which keeps a large advantage. The computer said that e5 is even much stronger because fe5 is not possible because of bishop g5 winning the exchange. And apart from that, white would take here, opening up the position even further for the two bishops, and white will slowly gain more and more space on the king side. And the computer gave a huge advantage, almost +2 here, which I'm not sure is so realistic, but white should have very, very good winning chances here. So Hans went rook d6, which I feel like is a very good practical try here. Because now what we are going to see, well, first of all, b takes e5, and there are some same color bishop endgames coming out, which are going to be super interesting, at least for me it was. Now the first question, which I've also asked my students, is how should you recapture here with black on c5? Both of the moves are already pretty bad for black, but I will already tell you now the solution. Knight takes c5 is probably the better try here. Because now, in order to keep an advantage, white should not take on c5, but instead go for a move like, for example, bishop b5, objectively keeping a large advantage. My analysis went as follows: a6, bishop e2 now. Now white has created another weakness on a6, rook c6, bishop d4, and in this variation, white at some moment gets e5, and the computer gave a decisive advantage for white here as well, which does make some sense just because the two bishops are so strong. And whenever white can capture on f6, after g takes f6, the pawn on h6 is going to become a weakness as well. And if black takes here, then g7 is another weakness. But rook takes c5, that's of course the question, which might have been what Anish was intending. But now the whole point of this type of bishop endgame is that black only has one defensive setup to hold the game here. And black needs to go for the move h6 here. If black would go for the logical move king d7, for example, and in this specific endgame, again, white has only one way to win, which is to play g5 here. Now you might ask, why is it so important that white gets g5 himself here? Because now the plan is going to be quite simple, as it happened in the game. Actually, let me jump to what happened there. So this was the position which was reached in the game, just that the bishop is on b3. I'll show you how Anish managed to convert. He went g5, bishop e6, king e3, put the king to f4, and at some moment he traded on f6, and then whenever the king moves, then e5 is going to be possible. And apart from that, if black would wait, for example, here, if Hans would have played bishop e6, then the plan is to slowly maneuver the bishop towards g4, and then king f5 is going to come, because the bishop has to move away from the long diagonal. In the game, Hans played king c5, and then e5 ended the game on the spot, because if black would take, then if king b4 just a6, and the f-pawn would be running down the board. King d5 was played, and this was how the game finished. f7, another nice move, and then king e5, and white is just going to put the pawn to f6, bishop c4, and then pick up the remaining pawn on a7, and is going to win the game. So here Hans resigned. So this was white's winning plan here. After g5, the position is a win for white, but a very important move here as well. Otherwise, black would be able to play h6 or even g5, possibly making a draw. So now you might ask, why is it so important how black recaptures on c5? Anyway, the same is going to come. But the amazing thing, as again, I have to give a lot of credit to Fabian and Christian for pointing all of this out on their YouTube channel. After knight takes c5, rook takes c5, b takes c5, bishop c5, now h6 does work. Now you might ask, why doesn't that work with black's bishop being on b3? So as it was in the game, b c5, rook takes b3, take, bishop takes c5. Now h6 does not work because of the amazing move bishop c8. And now black cannot unpin himself. If king d8 was also mentioned by Fabi, then bishop takes e6, and white is just going to pick up all of the pawns on the king side with bishop f8 to come on the next move. And if black does something like this, for example, then this was their analysis shown in the video. White is just going to slowly push f4, followed by e5, and black can basically resign because there's no way for black to get out of the pin. I should also mention that if black tries to get rid of the bishop on f5 at some moment, all of the pawn endgames should be lost. So white can just maybe go king e3 in this position, king d7, and then something like this should be winning for white. For example, f4 looks winning to me. So that's the whole point here with the bishop on b3. Black is not in time to play the move h6 because of the move bishop c8. And that's why it was actually the best try to take with the knight, when, again, I would be quite curious what Anish would have played here. I mean, bishop e5 is not really a human move. Also, bishop e2, for example, kept some advantage, but bishop e5 was by far the strongest here. And if rook c5, again, this position, if black manages to find h6, then white cannot improve the position. I should also mention some variations here. For example, if white goes for king e3, king d7, and take here, now black is ready to play g5 on the next move, setting up sort of a fortress. For example, if king f4, then g5 would come. Also, if king d4, g5, just now white cannot make any progress whatsoever. And if white goes h5, then what black can do is just wait like this, wait for e5 to happen, and then take and go king e7. When I've analyzed this game in particular with my students now, we also found a lot of endgames where the g-pawns were not there, and the white pawn was on h4, when in those cases the position was still a win for white. And why that's the case is because in some of those variations, white is trying to run to the queen side, and pretty often he's successful, because often bishop b5 is going to come, and then, for example, right here, bishop a4, bishop b5, and then king c6 would be possible. But here, with those pawns being fixed on light squares, black is always in time to get sufficient counterplay by the means of bishop d1, followed by grabbing some pawns there. But in all of those endgames, if, for example, there would be only a pawn on h4 and a pawn on h6, then it would be winning for white. Also, the same if a white pawn is on g3 and the black pawn is on g7. It's just about the white pawns being fixed on light squares. That's why this position is a draw, as far as I could understand it. So I think that was it about this game. I was super fascinated by this endgame in particular, and especially about Fabi's analysis. It was really enlightening to see that. I've never studied this particular endgame before, and it's quite useful to know that white is only winning by pushing g5 here in this position, which Anish nicely understood in the game. So thank you guys for watching. That was it for today. I'm going to see you soon at the European Team Chess Championship in Batumi, where I'm going to be traveling to with the Austrian team tomorrow. And the first round is already on Sunday. I don't know if I'm going to be playing there yet, but of course you guys are going to get daily recaps from there. So thank you guys for watching, and I'm going to see you guys soon.